certifications from IIT Madras and the Delhi School of Economics. He's a parent. He's been a parent for over 2 decades now. And he stumbled upon the potential that parenting holds to develop one's children. And that cannot be underestimated. This was through a 1-hour lecture on parenting that he attended. And since then, he has integrated engaged parenting with his professional life as an environment and climate change consultant. How wonderful to be working on 2 subjects which are absolutely the need of the hour today. So a very warm welcome to both of you, Tara and Vaidish. A very warm welcome to all those of you who've joined us from across the country and the world. Just a couple of things about housekeeping. Please put your questions in the chat. We will be spending the first 30 minutes or so in conversation with Tara and Vaidish. They will be taking questions from all of you, those of you who want to ask questions after that. Please put your questions in the chat, and you can do that right from the outset. This will be collated by our team, and I will put those to Vaidish and Tara. Vaidish and Tara, with your permission, shall we start?
Yes, let's get started. Yeah. I'd like to just state a few things as we get started. One is, it is important for all of us to recognize that we are here to share our experiences in parenting. We are not in any stretch of imagination experts. We would like to make that absolutely clear, because there's nothing like being an expert in parenting, because each parent is different, each child is different, and each parenting context is different. So any claim of being an expert is highly questionable. Given that, why are we sharing is because whenever we have shared some of our experiences with parents around us, we have found that they have come back to us saying, you know what, that's been very insightful, it's been helpful to us. So they encouraged us to share our experiences to a wider audience. So wherever opportunity offers itself, we do take the next step of actually sharing some of our expenses to a wider audience. But it's very important to recognize that we don't consider ourselves experts, and we are just merely sharing experiences. Over to you, Seema.
Thank you, Vaidish. So, right at the outset, given the topic of today's webinar, creating learning opportunities at home, I think the question, it seems pretty obvious, but I'd like to start by asking, what is learning? What does it mean to say learning opportunities? And how do you create such opportunities?
Okay, I think I'll start. Now, I'll address the what is learning. I think what learning opportunities are and how you create them will come up as we go along. So learning is often associated with studying, but it goes way beyond that. And it's not just about information or knowledge. We learn skills, abilities, capacities, and also mindsets and attitudes, certain ways of looking at things, which become habits of mind. All of that involves learning. So we could say that learning is a process that happens in the mind, a process that then results in a change, a reorganization, perhaps, of the mind and often the brain. And it can also happen in the body. For example, when you want to imitate someone, someone's mannerisms, your body is learning how to move or create that mannerism. Now, learning is not always conscious. For example, a child who happens to touch a flame and discovers that it burns you learns to avoid flames. To take an example from skills. Now, suppose we see someone drowning and needing help. Our response to that, our behavior, before we've learned to swim and after we've learned to swim, would be very, very different, right? So the point of these examples is that the change that happens in the mind or the body when we've learned something has consequences for our behavior as well. And somebody else can tell if we've learned something or not only from our behavior, from what they can observe. And this, by the way, includes performance in examinations, right? Which is why we have exams, I guess. Now, learning can also be conscious. And I think this is the important part for us here. When it is conscious, we need to ask what we are learning and why we are learning it. And this is not just for us, but for our children as well. What do we want our children to learn? Why do we want them to learn that? And in this, I think we need to make a distinction between learning that is valuable for us, that's, valuable for life, and learning that is not perhaps as valuable. This is the difference between learning for life and learning for exams. I think that's the distinction I'm trying to make. And if the purpose of learning is to meet the challenges of one's future life, whether it's personal or public or professional life, whichever, then what one learns would be very different from what one learns for exams alone. Right? And a lot of that valuable learning happens outside school, including at home. Sorry, I think I've taken too much time on that. I elaborated too much. Dish, you want to add to that?
Yeah, just to further describe the last point that you mentioned, it takes me back to one of my readings, which I think the book is called Experience and Education by John Dewey, where he speaks about educatedness or being educated, and tries to say what are those experiences which have educational value and which do not have educational value. We tend to assume that all of what happens in school has educational value, and therefore, and perhaps not all that happens at home has educational value. And then he goes ahead to actually give us one criterion to decide as to what has educational value, and he talks about the criterion being continuity, right? If there's something that you can hold on to for a longer period of your life, and then it has educational value. And then he particularly recalls that there is the examination system, wherein you have to memorize or recall for the purposes of an exam, but as after you complete the examination, there is little or no use for that recall, and therefore that doesn't necessarily constitute having any educational value. So what does have educational value, what does not have educational value? He goes by the criterion of continuity. So there are lots of experiences at home which bring about, which have educational value. And those are things that we should try to capture at home so that we could build educational value in our children. And that's perhaps what will unfold through the rest of today's session.
And I think, yeah, and I think that brings us logically to the next question: that what is the role of the home in a child's learning, and how do you create these opportunities that you all are referring to?
Okay, shall I go? Okay. Now, with or without schooling, and from their parents, and from you. So, for example, if a child hears a parent tell a lie, for example, let's say, or sees a parent treating someone inconsiderately, maybe the household help, stuff like that, the child is going to absorb those values no matter what they're taught explicitly in school or at home. Around the house and seeing people read those books, that is what's going to develop the reading habit. If children hear interesting ideas and discussions of public issues around them at home, they would get interested in those. So as parents, whatever we do at home, regardless of whether we teach them or what we teach them, the parent will be a role model, their inspiration, and you will play a role in shaping their aspirations. That dining table, how do you nurture these things? Dining table conversations that we have at a family, as a family. What we do with our children together in the kitchen, for example, or these things are far more important for their growth than what we do with them at the study table or as part of schoolwork. Just one more point and I'll stop. Having children participate in household chores and also in the care of the home and the environment, whether it's helping with cleaning or recycling, turning off lights, conserving water, not wasting food, a whole bunch of things like that. The earlier children learn these things, the better. And what I found is that involving them in these things makes them feel included, makes them feel that we depend on them, and make them proud that they are helping. And it develops both a sense of belonging and rootedness and of responsibility. So these...
Yeah, you gave a few examples. Let me just add to that by saying there are things, there are situations at home, and every situation or everything that we see around us offers a learning opportunity. Now, the issue at hand with parents, and it was with me, and I'd like to share my own experience, I didn't see the learning opportunity in the beginning. Yeah. It looks like there is a need for some level of training, some level of a mindset change in us to look at those situations and identify the learning opportunities in those situations, right? And once you get that mindset to actually look at the things around you or the situations you are in and convert them into learning opportunities, then everything seems to have a learning opportunity. Now, just to add to that further, some of the learning opportunities, even today for me, don't seem to have that kind of educational value. And others seem to have had a lot of educational value, right? So the distinction now becomes, which of those am I going to pick? So it's actually a situation wherein I have so many learning opportunities around me to figure out which of them I should pick. And that is totally dependent on what the age of the child is and what the child is interested in at that point in time, and what is that you can facilitate at that point in time. So it is not, it's something that you need to grow yourself into to be able to do that effectively. But I see learning opportunities everywhere. And my struggle is to figuring out which of the learning opportunities should I strike on at that point in time. Over to Seema.
I think that's a brilliant point that you brought out, Vaidesh, that there are learning opportunities no matter which way we look. And to be able to distinguish between those that have educational value and those that don't, based on what you shared about John Dewey's thought about the continuity. How do we equip ourselves to take on this role? The mindset that you spoke about, how do we empower ourselves with that mindset?
Would you not?
Tara, you going first?
No, you go ahead. Go ahead, Dish.
Yeah. First of all, in order to bring about that mindset change, one needs to introspect. Now, as a parent, most parents, particularly in the context of the pandemic, are looking at, they wake up in the morning, they see their children at home. Now, how do we engage our child through the day? It's a chore, it's a task that has to get accomplished. And they look around for activities that they need to do, which will or could have a positive impact on their learning, right? Now, that tends to look at things from bottoms up. That is, look at various activities, figure out what activities can I do today, prepare overnight for it, and then implement or execute those activities. That is something which I would say is a piecemeal approach. Whereas if you have the other approach, look at the broader picture, okay? figure out what is that which is going to be, what is your strength? What did you do during your schooling? What did you get out of your schooling? What is that you think your child needs to get at that time or during that age? And figure out as to whether you have the required competence to facilitate that learning. Now, if you answer yes, I have the required knowledge and competence to facilitate that learning, use that knowledge. If you don't have it, you got to pick that up before you actually facilitate that learning. And that requires some amount of time and effort to do it. But more importantly, look at it from the child's perspective and identify what are the goals or what are the learning outcomes that you would like to establish for the child in the context of the area that you have identified, right? Those could be a medium term, short term, or a day's outcome. Yeah. And then figure out as to what are the things that you would need to do in order to be able to facilitate that learning in the child, right? So what I'm suggesting is that if you have to bring that mindset change, you must recognize very clearly that you need to figure out what is that you are trying to do with the child, or what is the learning that you're trying to facilitate in the child up front, and then pick up what you need to do in order to facilitate the learning outcomes. Not scramble into the web and say, look, I need activities of this kind. There are multiple sources of activities which are available on the web. Pick this and put it in on a piecemeal basis. So there has to be a broader game plan. And I would even suggest that you need to have a broader game plan, whether it is COVID or pandemic related or across the whole of your child's schooling, because there are only certain things that the schools can do, and they are the first ones to more than readily accept that. And there are certain other things that a parent is better positioned to do. So as a parent, if you are an engaged parent, you look at what are the areas that you are planning to contribute to your child, have an overall game plan, and break it down, and then come down to a day-to-day level in terms of activities and figure out as to how you're going to go about those learning outcomes. Over to that.
Deej, before before Tara shares her perspective, would it be possible for you to share an example which would kind of illustrate what you shared with us? You know, when we're looking at a learning outcome, and let's take it very, very simple. Let's take a day-based learning outcome. You know, would you be able to illustrate with an example what that might look like? And you can choose an age of your choice, you know, for a child. And would you just be able to share an example, please?
Yeah, the first thing that take anything about, let's say, a simple experiment about salt and vinegar, right? And you're doing that experiment at home, and you want the child to figure out how you're going to conduct the experiment, what the outcome of the experiment is going to be, right? Just place the ingredients that are required for that experiment in front of the child and tell the child to figure it out. So every time that the child stumbles upon a problem, he or she will come to you and say, what do I do next? Right? Whereas the normal approach that we would have is that if you're doing an experiment, look at all, you read up the experiment, collect all the apparatus for the experiment, assemble it in front of the child, and say, this is what you have to do. So the child's takeaway there is that it's very task-based. My father has given me a task to do, and I've executed it, and I have come out with and I've seen the outcome of that task, and it ends there. Whereas if you adopt a more open-ended approach or an open-minded approach, you get on to getting the child to examine about the various ingredients, about the various apparatus. This may take a lot longer, right? But the idea is not to finish off the tasks one after the other. The idea is to promote the learning outcome, and that learning outcome may take a week or even 10 days. So be it. But that learning outcome is much richer than the child getting to know that this is what happens if I do that experiment, right? That's the nature of the activities that I would suggest that parents consider. Therefore, you're trying to make the child a self-dependent learner, right? Initially, of course, the child is going to be a dependent learner, but he or she has to be on a path to become a independent learner. And this is one way of actually going about it. Over to Tara.
Yeah, I just have one thing to add there to what Deesh said. That children actually are capable of becoming independent learners quite early in life. We think that we have to wait a long time, but that's not true. They can, you just have to. So, for example, when it comes to reading, if they're hesitant to read to them a story that they will really like, read it halfway and leave the book there and say, you don't have to take the time to read the rest. They'll go read it and learn to read. And, so too with a whole bunch of other things. So, once they've learned to learn on their own, they will find things to do. You don't have to be there with them all the time. Okay, I just wanted to.
And Tata, very interestingly, that brings to mind a question that, if we let children be, they're very, very capable in empowering themselves in ways that we want them to empower themselves. So what do you think typically comes in the way of that happening?
I think teaching comes in the way. Because we consciously teach them. We don't let them be. We need to let them ask their questions, listen to them, encourage them to share their thoughts with us. Ask them, so what did you read? What did you think of what you read? And do things together. That's I think teaching is what comes. And teaching and also judging them. Judging what they do, testing them, and so on. That's what comes in the way.
And while there's so much value, and I can clearly see what you're saying and how it would play out, but given the situation we are all in currently, and speaking specifically about the pandemic, and parents are juggling a whole lot of responsibilities. They're wearing hats they've never worn before. They're doing a whole lot of things that, have suddenly come as a surprise or a shock. And it leaves little time or energy or even mind space to really, create these kind of good learning opportunities for children despite our best intentions. So how do you think we can weave this learning into our routine within our homes, especially now because we're all quite literally stuck at home. We can't even, go for a walk or anything. And if we're lucky, we may have a terrace or a larger compound to play in, but if not, we are at home. So how do we weave this learning into our daily routines?
Right. So yes, the current situation is a tough one, and we're all in this together. As parents of children who are at home from school, what can you do? Without making any claims here, just taking off from things that I've gathered from what parents have told me, I'd like to throw out some ideas that have worked very well for some people. The examples I give would be more relevant for younger children, but some of it would be relevant for older children also. So one of the things that they do is make a weekly timetable. Find 2 hours in the timetable, just 2 hours a day, 5 days a week. And it doesn't have to be Monday to Friday necessarily. It can be, any 5 days of your choice. Label them as school at home and make it clear that this is your focused time together to learn. That's the first thing. Second, this is where what Deesh was suggesting comes in, the kinds of learning activities that with learning outcomes in mind. Actually, it could be, and these have to be planned. It could be playing chess, which is a great way to learn, or knitting, sewing, crocheting, sing with them, dance with them, or paint with them. But you do need to dedicate that time for being with them. And it's 2 hours a day, 5 days a week. That shouldn't be too much, right? It could be reading stories together, discussing the stories, or acting out the stories together like a play. If children get a planting pot with soil in it, they can plant seeds in them and see them, watch them sprout and grow. These are all fun learning activities, and you will find that they actually energize you, right? The, the third thing is get them to pick their favorite activity and say what they like about it. Now, when they do that, it's a great language lesson and also a lesson in their organizing and articulating their thoughts in a way that others get them. One last thing that I've seen is of great value for children is I mentioned the timetable. As part of that timetable, at the end of the week, have a slot called weekly review. And in that, have each child do something, write or speak, something that includes what they did. So it's trying to remember everything that they did, what they enjoyed about it, what they didn't like and why, and finally, what they learned from it. This then becomes conscious learning, right?
I just would like to add one. It does take a bit of effort and time to bring about that mindset change. And once you have that mindset change, then you could quite easily use the time that you have to gainfully engage with your child. Now, even after that, if you feel that you don't have enough time, what we are urging you to do is two things. One is whatever time you have, use that time effectively. Don't fritter away the time. Have an overall game plan, as Tara mentioned, and execute activities that you would do with your child in the context of the game plan. It's very important that these activities are not completely disjointed because it needs to connect together for the child. And therefore, you need to put in some level of inputs. And this can be over 2-3 months. But whatever little you do has a lot of educational value that you could extract from it. The other thing which is happening a lot these days, which I would urge you to caution you, is that you see today the office is in bedroom 1 and school is in bedroom 2. And if the parent has had a bad time in a meeting on Zoom, then he or she goes out of the bedroom and sees the child and is in a foul mood. And often it does happen that you need to, you see your child doing something which is even, marginally incorrect, and then you take off on the child. Now, this is something that we need to exercise some level of restraint from. And I'm told that this is happening. And it's not an easy one because we are all humans. We are being pushed. There is a lot of pressure in our day-to-day lives. So if you can take a deep breath, a moment's silence, some quiet time, and then engage with your child, I think a lot gets achieved. So two things I would suggest. One is try to keep your office anxieties and the office pressures completely away from the child, because the child cannot receive that. That's something which is very clear. And the second is, even if you get a little bit of time, use the time gainfully. You may not achieve as much as somebody who's able to do that much more than you do, but whatever little that you could do, remember the school can't do it. And it's you as a parent who should be able to do it. I noticed that there is some focus on getting more examples and more interest in more examples and how to do this, what kind of topics to cover and so on. Tara's given you a few. There's one book that I used in my, when I was engaging with my children, which I found very useful. It's called Big Questions from Little People and Simple Answers from Great Minds. Yeah, it's got about 40 to 50 lovely short stories of how to explain very difficult concepts in simple language. So what I used to do is I used to read this up. I wasn't satisfied with the content there. I used to, embellish the content with more information. And then I used to use one topic over 2 or 3 weeks. So that's the amount of material that there is in that simple book. Right? So I use that gainfully to facilitate It could be questions like, why is water wet, right? Or it could be questions like, why is the sky blue? Or, what are dreams made of? It's actually a lovely book which asks very simple questions, and through actually addressing those questions, you get to facilitate your child's learning substantively. I'll stop there. Over to Seema. Tara.
I'd just like to add one thing in this context. Deesh mentioned, coming out of your workroom and going to your children. And he mentioned quiet time. Now, I think that taking that time, even 5 minutes a day, with the children, doing some kind of quiet time, I wouldn't call it meditation for very young children, though I've seen children, including 3-year-olds, do that. That quiet time of reflecting, taking deep breaths, and just letting go is very important, as both individually and as the family.
Absolutely, Tara and Deesh, the importance of really building that pausing muscle as a parent is so crucial, especially in today's times, because as Deesh very rightly pointed out, we are coming out of one room and that's our office, and the boundaries are so blurred, and sometimes it can be really hard to hold ourselves back. And that actually is leading me to question that, I was actually thinking, if everything is going to be a learning opportunity, where's all the fun and play? But Tara, your answer kind of said, oh, it's all fun and play, and and we can draw so much learning out of it. And so my question is, which of our actions are actually helping our children, and which of our actions actually end up curbing their interests or learning? I mean, and how do we kind of distinguish those? Because because like you rightly said, if you're going to bring in our anxieties while we are exploring these learning opportunities with our children, are we going to be ending up doing more harm than good? Because we are all human and we all come with our own individualized baggages. So how would you kind of caution a parent against that? Or what are the things we need to watch out for to ensure that we're actually helping them and not curbing their interests?
One of the things very quickly is not forcing them. If it's not seen as a painful duty, that's when learning is joyful, right? So that's where you have to figure out what it is that really interests your child. And now, if there is something that's valuable the child needs to learn and doesn't want to, then you're going to have to find ways of making it interesting for the child. But other than that, like I said earlier, anything can be made into, it's not that you're making it just fun and games, but you're also focusing on the learning that comes out of it. I think, Seema, if we go into the details of that, I think we're already we've shot over time. So if Deesh wants to add something.
Just a very quick one. One very simple thumb rule that I used and I still use is anything that closes the doors is harmful. So whatever interventions you do, you make sure you're open-minded and leave the doors of learning open to the child. How do you know as a parent that that door is closed? And I'm saying this with a lot of focus and emphasis because unfortunately in the school systems that prevail, there is a lot of information that the child receives and the child is told that's it. So this is what you need to know, you know that. And does not let the child keep the door open. So the more doors you close, the more harm that you're creating. So light touch, as well as making sure that you're open-minded in your intervention and leaving it open for the child to explore as his or her life unfolds. That I think is very important. So I know there are standard approaches to, standard styles of parenting that we have heard of, being authoritative, being permissive, the authoritarian, I meant, being firm parents, but making sure that there is an open-mindedness in the approach that you adopt, and also helping the child if there is an approach in school which is actually closing the doors of learning in any particular topic. Opening the door is something that I think is a parent's responsibility, and keeping that door open is what I think a parent should do.
Nicely put. Yes, Steve.
And I'm so tempted to say, can you please give us an example about that, Dish? Because very often it's the way we communicate to our children, and it sometimes it may come with our best intentions. And what Tara said earlier really stayed with me, that we are so focused on judging and evaluating and making sure that they've learned it the right way, that we lose focus of the fact that they're learning all the same. So, Dish, would you be able to give an example? Let's say we were talking about the salt and vinegar experiment. Would you be able to kind of illustrate how a parent might close the door versus leaving it open for, really engaging that curiosity?
Yeah, let me try. Going back to the salt experiment. Now, when a child uh, takes a little bit of salt and puts the salt in his or her tongue, there is a feeling of being salty, right? Now, when a parent puts the same salt into his or her tongue, there's a feeling of being salty. Now, is the sense of being salty what is defined in the child's brain and what is defined in the parent's brain the same? Right? So the whole concept of being salty is very dependent on each individual. Right? So what is saltiness is itself something that can be examined further. Right? And how does anyone know whether the nature of it being salty is the same across any two individuals? Right? This is something that you're keeping the basic concept of being salty open-ended, and you're leaving the child to explore that further. Right? Those are the kinds of things that you could constantly use to figure out, to keep the doors open. Yeah, I actually picked this up in a school where my son studied, and they had a whole 2-hour session on what is salty, right? And it was amazing to see how the children in the class actually engaged on the subject of saltiness. Right? So we have a fixed notion of what saltiness is. So is that correct? Are we closing the door there? So that's the point I'm trying to make.
Can I just give another example?
Sure, that.
That's all right. Okay, so this is a story. Uh, this is a conversation where you have the mother, an 8-year-old child, and a 5-year-old child. The older child asks the mother, "Mama, how come wet clothes get dry faster if you blow on them?" And the younger one pipes in and says, "Because the water evaporates." And then the girl says, "How come tea cools faster if you blow on it?" And again, the younger one has an answer: "Because the heat evaporates." Now, the child has some meaning for evaporate. If you dismiss it, if you say that the child has a misconception of evaporating and try to correct it, you've closed the door, right? The child has, obviously, it means this for a 5-year-old, it means disappeared or something like that. We don't know what the child really means. And so being open to that kind of thing is very necessary.
So essentially, being curious about what our children are saying and what it means to them is actually leaving the doors open. And while that sounds fairly simple, I can imagine it was really, really hard to practice. But I think this is something that each of us can definitely aspire to. It's not it's not impossible to be curious about what's going on in our children's heads, and the way they express it. And we have a few questions coming from the audience, and I'd like to put those across to the both of you. And this is very interesting, I think, for this generation. My child gets distracted easily while learning, but watches YouTube videos without distractions. And I believe that he or she is referring to YouTube learning videos. Could you please suggest tips to avoid distractions while learning? I think it's so true in so many of our homes that the screen is a teacher, and it seems to keep the children far better engaged than despite our best efforts. So I would really like to hear your thoughts on this, Tara and Dish.
Yeah, in terms of dealing with distractions, it is indeed a tough one. Now, let me just tell you how we have tried to do this at home, and maybe there are some lessons embedded in that. If there is an alternative use of the time, which is very compelling, then the child is attracted to that alternative use of time. So there is little or no point in the child trying to do what he or she was asked to do when that distraction is so enveloping. So the way to go about it would be, okay, if the distraction is so strong, what the child should do or what the parent should do is give the child a time to actually go through with the distraction for a certain period of time, and then get back to the activity that needs to get done. What we have tried to use in such instances are what are called Pomodoros, where we time, let's say 20 minutes you focus on this activity, and then you get distraction time for 10 minutes. Rather than allowing the distraction to interfere with the 20 minutes of the activity, which was intended activity, you say 20 minutes, you do the activity, and you get 10 minutes of the distraction that you also want. So what tends to happen is the mind uses the 20 minutes quite effectively in the activity, and is looking forward to the 10 minutes of the distraction. The problem really happens when the distraction is actually intervening or interfering with the activity. Therefore, neither is the distraction being enjoyed, nor is the activity being accomplished. Tara, I'd like to add?
Yeah, I just think one of the problems is screen time, whether it's the phone or the computer, and that does interfere with things because somehow that's really attractive for children. So if you can reduce screen time, that is one way. This is in addition to what Dish just suggested. That's a great suggestion. And also, this taking a moment to breathe, to just pause. If that can become part of a a habit, when you're distracted, pause, take that distraction. Go to the distraction, be done with it, and come back. Also, that quiet time when you focus on something, even 3 minutes, 5 minutes, that contributes to sustained attention, for example.
Yeah, there's one more thing I'd like to add, Seema, if you allow me, is that distraction, or when you're using the internet or you're using screen time, is not only a problem with children, it's also a problem with parents, right? They're constantly, this is how the whole internet advertising agencies are working, because they just give you pop-up windows and they nudge you into various websites, and you actually go into into an area of activity which you never actually started. And this is something that the advertising agencies are using in a very structured and a systematic manner to get you into websites that you don't, you never intended to. And very often, adults tell me that, wow, I was never there. I was never planning to be there, but I spent half an hour or 45 minutes in something I never intended to be in. Now, ask yourself as parents, how do you do it at home? Because in that ecosystem, how do you manage to address the problem that is confronting you, right? And therein lies the solution as to how you would advise your child to do it. Because implement the solution yourself in your context, and and then you will come up with very specific suggestions as to how you could do it in your child's context. To give you one very particular example, I have a separate browser for the websites, and I have a separate browser for my email. So when I go into my emails, I've told myself I will never go into the browser which accesses websites, right? So it's a strict rule for me, that because I found that when I was accessing my email, I'll see some pop up, and then I'll go into a website that the email browser actually leads me on to. So there are some things that you can do based on the family ecosystem as how it works for you, and you could try to do the same thing for your child.
Yeah, one other quick thing. Find a greater distraction that has some learning value. So that's possible.
I think that's the elusive nugget for a lot of parents. But I really find a lot of value in what you said about acknowledging the distraction. And of course, really looking deep down as to our behavior and the ecosystem we are creating, because as you very rightly pointed out right at the start, the children are learning even when we are not consciously teaching them. And but I had a question for Deesh when he talks about this Pomodoro activity with the 20 minutes of activity and 10 minutes of distraction, which is all kind of planned. I think that might work well for slightly older children, but I'm curious, how it might play out for younger children, who are like, oh, if I do this and I'm going to get 10 minutes of, whatever it is that they're looking forward for. And then how do you tackle something like that? Because then, though that was not the original intention, it's again become a task. I need to do this so that I can get that 10 minutes of distraction. So, how do you work with that?
Yeah, let's say if there is the 20-minute activity that you want the child to do, if the activity is interesting enough, then it has educational value, right? And if it has education, it's interesting enough, the child is engaged in it, and the educational value will drive, therefore there is a continuity to that learning, and therefore it's useful. Whereas if the child is not going to be engaged in that 20-minute activity and finds it boring, why should the child do it? Let the child not do it. It makes no difference in the long run, right? So find activities which have educational value and which are interesting, which the child will engage in, and which has continuity, it has learning continuity to it. Then it makes sense, right? The problem I see with most parents is that I wouldn't say most parents, with many parents, is that they are very hard-coded about what activities they have to do because somebody has told them that has educational value. Question that is my point. Right? If it's an activity which is not interesting and the child is not engaged in it, it's 99% sure that that has no educational value for your child. So then why? Right? Find some other activity that you could do. Now, this is where a parent has a particularly important role, because sometimes the schools will say, you have to do that activity. They thrust it on you. Sometimes it's very difficult when you are dealing with the school to be able to manage it, but you know very well that there is no educational value for your child in doing that activity. What I would suggest is manage the school, because there is no educational value. You're convinced about it. The child is not engaging in that activity. Figure out something else to do in the 20 minutes.
And these, what I'm taking away from this also is that, coming back to what Tara had said earlier, that about, really ask your child what they're interested in and work with that. And and this is the bit, you said that if it doesn't have educational value for your child and that's why they're not engaging in it, is it safe to say that it has no educational value for them at that point and we can try again later?
Absolutely. I would strongly say that.
Okay.
I'll give you one example. My son was very poor in drawing, right, as an artist, but he went to an art class, and he was so poor that I was telling the art teacher, who, it's time that we pull him out. There's no point. He's not showing any sense or any interest in art. So then the art teacher, fortunately, is a man of repute. He said, "No way. What do you know about art to tell me that the child has not got any interest in art? Let him continue doing it." He used to go for art class day in and day out, and I mean 3 times a week. And he used to come out saying it's such a boring session. He did it totally disinterested. He distracted everybody else all the time, and he was quite a pain. But the art teacher did not let me withdraw him from the class. He said, something may happen sometime, right? And then about 5 or 6 years later, the school writes to me saying that, wow, this guy's sculpting is probably one of the best that we have seen, right? Now, we have no idea what happens in the child's brain, and we have to have the humility to accept it, right? Which is why I said you should be open-minded. Don't close the door of art education to him at that age. He may exhibit all the signs of not being interested at all, right? Park it, saying maybe this interest will come up at a later stage. So keep it open-ended.
Yeah, and this is one place where only the parent can really decide this. Watch the child, be open to what the child is doing and might be interested in. I think, yeah, the parent has to really, and each child is different in this. So there's no algorithm that you can go by.
I'm very conscious we're at 8 o'clock and I would like both of your permission, if it's okay for us to have one more question before I summarize. And then Tara and Deesh wanted to share with all of you the course that, Think has on an annual basis, which is all about learning. And please do look at their website when you get a chance. It's absolutely fantastic, the kind of resources they have there. So what would that be okay if we extend it by one question and then summarize and then course details? Does that sound okay?
That's fine. But Seema, can I just add something to what Tara said? I think it's important.
Sure.
I think it's important for every parent to recognize that what schools give you is mass education, right? And if each child is different, the only person who can actually figure out what is the interest and the passion for the child is the parent. It's impossible for the school to look at each individual child and figure out what the interest and the passion of the child is, right? So the role of the parent becomes very important to facilitate what is that is so important, could be the area of interest or the area of passion for the child. So the identification of that area of interest is largely the parent responsibility. It does happen in some cases that the child stumbles upon it, but it doesn't always happen. So there has to be an engaged effort that the parent undertakes to be able to find that passion. Once that passion is found, then there's no stopping the child. And each child has an individual different passion and interest. And who better to find that than the parent?
And there are two questions which are kind of related, and that will probably be the last question we take for the day. One is, the struggle that parents have with engaging the children while they're studying school subjects. And as much as we'd like to follow the children, there are some compulsions that parents need to adhere to. The second kind of related question is about interest in general, about the observation of a child. And, parents just ask, what if the interests keep changing? Would you all be able to address both of these points, please?
Ish, you want to go first?
Yeah, okay. On the subject-based, whatever topics the school covers, it's something that you have to do to go through schooling. So it's something that you just need to get your child to do. But one request I would make of parents is, please don't get them to excel in it. That's fully under your control, right? Now, if the person, if your child is, performing at, let's say, 40% or 50%, it's perfectly fine. It doesn't have to be 100%, because one of the things that we are recognizing increasingly is that the schools, the educational system, unfortunately, is pumping information into our children, right? It is required to some extent, and you need to pass exams and all of that. You've got to enable your child to figure out a way of cracking that system. But that's not enough. There are other things that the child needs to do in order to be educated. So if you can let go of the accelerator and say, look, you don't need to get 100% in your, and make it a practice. He said, in fact, I went through a situation wherein I told my child, he said, oh, he did very well. I said, why the hell are you doing well? Why are you not using your time to do something else? Because there's so many things outside of school which has got educational value. So bring that in as a part of your ecosystem, that you are not going to give that much importance to subjects as much as you're going to give to deriving educational value from experiences around you. And that will stand in greater stead for your child.
Yeah, no, actually, this might be a slight deviation from the question that you asked, but something that is relevant, related, and important, I thought. Part of this is not testing your child, because we always want to find out if the child has learned something. And to show the difference here, I'd like to give 3 quick scenarios, which I hope will bring out the distinction in painting. He had a wonderful sense of color, which he still has at 30. But made the children do mechanical drawings, use prescribed colors that she insisted on them, comparing them with the others. In less than a couple of months, this child was he wanted out. And for a very long time, he just hated painting and art or in general. So that's one scenario. A second scenario, which is very different. This is where a child was interested in dance and seemed to have it in her. And when she was about 7, her parents bumped into a dancer couple who were also excellent teachers. And so one day they took the child to one of their classes, their teachers' classes, just to watch, with no other, there was nothing said about it. And in the middle of the session, the teacher asked this child, said, you look like you want to jump into the session and dance. Do you want to do that? Do you want to join? And she said, yes. And she joined and became a dancer. That's her identity. So that's the kinds of the difference there. A third scenario, I mentioned meditation before. So there was this person who taught a 3-year-old child a short, simple, fun meditation of an imaginary bubble that goes in through the nose and goes around the body and stuff. Now, the child was there. I mean, a 3-year-old, she learned it, sort of. But the person wondered if it had made an impact on the child. A few days later, the mother reported, that, the child's mother, she said the child was sitting cross-legged, eyes closed, and the movement of the arm suggested that this was the movement of the bubble through the body. And so obviously, and she was sitting very still for a few minutes. How do you, obviously the child had an impact. But if we had tried to explore, if in those situations you tried to test the child, we want to know whether the child has learned. That defeats the purpose. I think that temptation, the temptation to test the child, to find out if the child has received what he was or she was offered, that just doesn't work. So we have to be patient. That's, I think, the biggest thing in parenting: patience.
Absolutely. Deesh and Tara, you've been very generous with your time. I'd like to summarize this session before y'all are able to speak to the audience about the course that ThinQ is offering. And we started with the understanding the breadth of the scope of learning, and how it can be conscious or unconscious. And a very important takeaway for me that our learning has consequences for our behavior, and very, very important to think about what we are learning and why we are learning, rather it be a mechanical process. And to really distinguish between whether we are learning for life or learning for exams, and that's so relevant given the system that is prevalent in our society today. um, and the criterion for deciding whether we're learning for life is whether we are going to be able to hold on to that for a longer period of time, and that if we do, that definitely has educational value. um, a very, very wonderful reminder that our children are learning even if you're not actively teaching them, and that dining table trumps the study table. And that's oops.
Seema, we can see you. Please continue.
I'm sorry, I've lost connectivity.
No, we can hear you. Continue.
Okay, I'm sorry, my screen went blank. Okay, I'm glad you all can still hear me. And the dining table gives, the conversations at your dining table will give children the sense of inclusion, belonging, rootedness, and responsibility, something that we all aim, aspire for. Um, as parents, let's look at activities that are going to have a positive impact. But while we are doing that, while we have a large overall game plan and broad goals for a child's learning, it's really important that we move from a task-based approach to a curiosity-based approach, because that will help our children move from dependent learning to self-dependent learning. Again, very beautifully reminded that children actually learn beautifully if you just let them be. So if we can let them be, we don't judge them, we don't evaluate them, we don't test them, I think we will really be encouraging them. Um, Tara gave us a beautiful idea of how we can set a 5-day timetable. 5 days, not necessarily 5 weeks. It can be any 5 days of the week where we can dedicate time once we have thought what our learning outcome goals for our children are. And, get your children to pick their favorite activity, observe their interests. You're the only person who has that insight into your child. Build on that, get them to talk about their favorite activity, help them organize and articulate their thoughts, and then have a slot for weekly reviews, because then what you're doing is really encouraging conscious learning for your child. um, let's remember that it's really important, especially in these times, to separate our anxieties, and our children cannot be the recipients of that. And learning is not a painful duty, so let's try and make it as enjoyable as possible. And the way we can do that is by keeping doors to communication open, and what keeps that open is our curiosity as to why a child is saying what he or she said, why they are doing what he or she is doing. If they're distracted, which could very well be the case with children, very valuable to acknowledge that distraction so that they can come back to the activity once it's been acknowledged. Um, it's been a wonderful session, and ThinQ is offering a course on learning. And before we move on to Deesh and Tara um, telling us about that course, and those of you who may be leaving the session, I'd like to just say a huge thank you to all of you for joining us today. And Parenting Matters offers a wide variety of courses, webinars, um, workshops, talks, one-on-one sessions, all of that. Please let us know how we can support you. You will find details about all the work that we do and a whole lot of resources available on our website, parentingmatters.in. And over to Deesh and Tara now for them to share about their course. And they will be here for another 5 minutes or so after they have shared about the course to answer any questions you may have specifically about the course. Please, if you do wish to get in touch with them regarding the session, you may write into them. I believe their details have been shared with you all on chat. Over to you, Deesh and Tara.
Yeah, thanks very much, Seema. Just to, I mean, we've been talking about the mindset change that's required to become a learner, to facilitate learning. So what Think offers is a 5-month course, which starts in the middle of May and goes on till October. The website reference for that is think.education/IIE, which has all the information and details that you would need. Basically, what the course does over the 5 months is it gives you insight into learning. And what is it that learning is? If you have to facilitate learning yourself, I mean, if you have to facilitate learning, you'll have to appreciate learning as well as become a learner yourself. Now, obviously, we all have constraints of time in terms of how much time we can invest in a course or invest in facilitating learning. But what this course will tell you is give you some amount of insight on what it is to facilitate learning and be able to use whatever time you make available for learning to facilitate learning. So may I request all of you to actually visit the website, and if you have any further questions, we'll take a 2-minute break. You can come back and we'll be available on the same link. If you have any further questions, me and some of my colleagues will be able to answer your questions. So I don't want to take, I have a very much longer version of the description of the course, but I don't want to take your time given that we've already extended beyond our committed 1-hour session. So anyone who's interested, please stay back and we'll be more than happy to expand on this further. Thank you very much, Seema.